April 9th, 2019. Does anybody remember where you were? It was a Tuesday. I remember it because, for a number of reasons, but the night before, April 8th, 2019, I was up really late because the University of Virginia men's basketball team won the NCAA National Championship, beating Texas Tech. Long game, overtime. It's a terrific game. UVA wins the game. And I watched that game sitting in the living room of the house that I grew up in, sitting next to my father. Why was I at home at my dad's house on a Monday night? The game ended at about 1 something. It was late. And I got up about 2 hours later. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I took a shower. And I got a little backpack that I had, and I walked out of my house, down the steps of the house I grew up in. I look back on the steps, and there's Dad and June, 3:30 in the morning. I walked down the driveway, and I got in the car. My friend John Hollab, who I'm going to talk about, picked me up. And we drove the 4 hours from Hamilton, New Jersey, to Altoona, Pennsylvania, where the Loretto Federal Correctional Institution is located, where I was going to spend the next 18 months of my life. We drove across the Pennsylvania Turnpike, stopped at a Starbucks for my last Starbucks for a while, and we pulled into FCI Loretto. I want you to picture in your mind what this looks like. FCI Loretto is a really big federal prison, about 1,000 inmates, and this is what you'd picture a prison to look like. Guard towers, multiple layers of barbed wire. Next to it is this couple of buildings, this little camp, satellite camp. And that's where I was going. We pulled into the parking lot there at Loretto, and I got out of the car, gave John a hug, and I walked into federal prison. You push a button, you open the door, you walk in, and I was wearing this gray sweatshirt and gray sweatpants and white sneakers that somebody had told me they may let you keep. And I walked in, and I stood there in the lobby, and they called a corrections officer to come get me. It was like checking into the Marriott. And I waited, and a correctional officer came and got me, and he started the check-in process, and then we walked out of that entryway and walked around the big prison to this very large gate. And that's how you start the process. Because the processing of going into prison took place in the big prison. And as we got to the gate, there was another corrections officer at the gate who says to the officer that was walking me there, "It thinks it can wear the gray and that we'll let it keep it." The dehumanization began within moments of arrival. And then you go through the process of checking in. They make you take all your clothes off. They do a strip search. The whole thing you see about, body cavity search. Then you meet with a doctor. And I didn't really have any medicine to check in, but if you have medicine, check in. Then they have you meet with a psychiatrist. I'm sitting there in this, they've now put on this green one-piece uniform. And I'm sitting across the desk from the psychiatrist who's got my folder, and she says, "Are you feeling any stress?" And I'm like, I'm about to check into prison for a year and a half. But of course you say no. And then for the first time, and only time, I was locked in a cell. Because all through the process of the case, I always had bail. So I was never handcuffed, I was never locked up. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in a prison cell on this very cold steel, just like you'd see in a movie. I sat there in this cell for hours, locked in. And I thought, how did my life get here? And all of those feelings of regret and anger. And, years before, I was giving a tour of the World Trade Center to the Queen of England. I was running, as you heard, running airports. Before that, I was a state senator sponsoring really big legislation. And now I'm sitting in a steel-locked federal prison cell. And I thought back, and some of you know the timeline. I thought back of, it all started 6 years prior to me sitting in that cell, when lanes of the George Washington Bridge were closed or reallocated. And in January of 2014, the United States Attorney in the Department of Justice decided to start investigating Bridgegate. And the world blew up. You can Google my name and the word bridge. It's like 3 million hits. In May of 2015, I was indicted by a grand jury, me and Bridget Kelly, who had worked in the governor's office. The only two people charged in the Bridgegate case. In November of 16, I was convicted of 9 counts of breaking federal law by a jury that deliberated for a week. We got bail, and we waited for the Court of Appeals. 2 years later, in 2018, it's now been 5 years since all of it had started. On a Tuesday morning right after Thanksgiving, I got a call that the Third Circuit, the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, had ruled they threw half of the charges out and kept half of the charges, which meant that I needed to get resentenced, and I had to make a decision. And I took the train down to Hamilton that night, and Dad and June and we went to dinner at Outback Steakhouse. And over grilled salmon, and I think a bloomin' onion, I had to make a decision. Bridget, as you may know, has young kids. And she had every incentive to stay out of prison in whatever hope she could of not having to go in. I have the opposite. I have older parents. And my biggest fear was, what if something happened while I was in prison to Dad and June? They got sick, they twisted an ankle, they needed help, and I am sitting in federal prison and can't be there. If that couldn't make matters worse. So I made the decision that morning on the way down to the Outback that I was going to go in and get it over with. Keep the appeal to the Supreme Court going. But I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor. The odds of the United States Supreme Court accepting any particular case are about 1 in 10,000. As a criminal defendant, the odds are even worse. And I said, it's time. Let's keep the appeal going, but let's go in and start serving. And I did. It really was not a hard decision. So I went in on April 9th. And eventually I got out of that cell, and an officer came over, Officer Sheehan, and he picked me up and walked me to the camp. And he said to me, now, Loretto, Pennsylvania is a beautiful part of western Pennsylvania. It really is a beautiful area. And Officer Sheehan said 2 things to me. He said, you shouldn't be here, and you're going to be okay. And I walked in this green uniform, and everybody knows you're the new guy, right? Because you're the guy in the... I walk in, they take me to my bunk, and in Loretto, the bunks are these big, long, think like a bad summer camp. Big, long rooms, there's no cells, there's no bars, you're like in this big bunk beds. And I walk over to my bunk, and there's 2 guys standing there at the bunk, happen to be talking to each other, and one of them says, I'm Bob Datillo. What's your name? I said, I'm Bill Baroni. He says, where are you from? I said, I'm from New Jersey. He says, I'm from New Jersey. And Bob Datillo, at that moment, a guy I never met before, showed me more kindness. Because I'm this scared guy who's suddenly in federal prison. And Bob Datillo grabbed me and said, you're going to be okay, and takes me down and sits me at the cafeteria and says, you're going to sit there every meal. And I sat across from him every meal. And he kept me out of trouble. And that's how I started. And being in prison it's a monotonous life. You get up every morning, you work out, read. I got to teach classes. Dinner's at 3 o'clock. Mail call, which was a big deal, getting letters. Watch some TV and you go to bed. Do it all over the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And I was going to do this for 18 months. But I also saw in prison people who were battling real depression, real mental illness, people whose family don't come to see them. And that was my life. And it got to be June of that year. And the Supreme Court appeal was going, and we knew that they'd make a decision at some point in June. And quite frankly, I was convinced that decision was going to be to turn us down because it's 1 in 10,000. And the last Friday in June, now there's no cell phone service. There's no internet in prison. They have an email system, but there's no internet access. So I talked to my friend Sue Ferrara. And I said, look, on Friday the 28th, they're going to issue the cases. It was the last day. They're going to issue the cases, whether they take them or not, at 9:30. At 9:40, I'm going to call you. She said, sure. Got up in the morning, did my workout, start walking the track, which I did every day. My friend June. And 9:40, I go pick the phone up. Call, dial Sue. She picks the phone up. She's hysterical on the phone. They took the case. They took the case. I'm like, Sue, they didn't take the case. Sue, I am a lawyer. Just read me what it says. And sure enough, the Supreme Court of the United States took the case. A couple days later, I was ordered released immediately. And John Holub had come back that morning. He didn't know when I was going to get released. He comes back that morning to pick me up. We drove out of the parking lot. And you all remember what happened next? January of 2020, one of the last cases the Supreme Court heard in person before COVID, including Justice Ginsburg, heard the case, and a few months later, in May of 2020, unanimously ruled in our favor. This is a Supreme Court that can't agree on what time of day it is. 9 justices agreed that Bridget and I had been wrongly convicted. Wow. And somebody said to me, more than one person, you must regret going in. You got to regret it. And Bridget never had to go in. You didn't have to go in, Bill. You could have stayed home. You could have waited it out. You must regret it. And I don't. For 2 reasons. The first reason I don't regret going into prison, because at that moment, that was the right decision to make. At that moment, I had to choose between taking a 1 in 10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 odd chance of the Supreme Court taking the case, but pushing back 5 or 6 months and the possibility that Dad and June could get sick, or get it started. So I don't regret it because it was the right decision at the right time. But here's why I also don't regret it. It reminded me of 3 really important things that I think in politics, maybe in business, sometimes you need reminding. The first reminder was how important your family is. You know, when I was running around in politics, and I know many of you, you'd see me at events, I'd be going table to table, and there was always something I had to miss, a birthday or a party or something with the family, because there was always something to do. But when you go through something like this, and all the people, 90% of the people I knew in my life in politics disappeared, my family was there. They were not only there on the steps when I went down to get in a car to go to prison, they were there every day in federal court seeing their son put on trial. They were there when a juror stood up and said guilty 9 times. They were there when the judge said 18 months in federal prison. Your family is there. And whether it's business or politics, being reminded of that. Now, hopefully none of you have to go through this to be reminded of it. But what a reminder it was. And I remember even going through the process. You know, this is something I haven't talked about. But the prosecutors, the government, 3 times in the course after I was indicted, 3 times asked me to plead guilty. Plead guilty. The last time they said, plead to anything. I remember sitting with Dad and June, and I was tired. This had gone on for years. I couldn't move on. I couldn't go away. I couldn't travel home to Ireland. I was stuck. My life was stuck. And I was just like, let's get this over with. And my father says, my father, who's an Irish-Italian guy from the South Bronx, says to me, we don't plead guilty. We don't plead guilty to things we didn't do. I was like, well, we don't go to prison. But I knew it would break my father's heart. It would be better for me to go to prison than to plead guilty to something I didn't do. And that's what my family is for. But of course, your family is also, I must tell you, your family is also very good at keeping you humble. So there I am, I'm in prison. And as I mentioned before, visiting is a big deal. Big deal. And your immediate family, your parents, your spouse, if you have them, kids, if you have them, can come to visit almost immediately. So I was there about a week and a half. And honestly, I was doing fine. I was surrounded by friends like Bob and others that were taking care of me. I was fine. I honestly slept great. I was never at risk. I was never at any physical harm. I was doing fine. And that Saturday, Dad and June were going to come visit. So the Friday night, they drove the 4 hours from Hamilton to Altoona, and they were staying at the Courtyard by Marriott in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And I talked to Dad the night before. I said, Dad, now remember, visiting is from 8:30 to 2:30. So get here about 8:15, go through security, and we can visit from 8:30. I will be there. I said, but Pop, don't forget, at 9:30 in every prison in America, they count all the inmates. So if I'm with you in the visiting room, they'll count me there. But if not, they shut the whole prison down at 9:30, and we have to go back to our bunks and get counted there. Oh, no. We'll be there 8:30, don't worry about it. And my father, former military guy, very prompt. I get up that morning, I put on my green uniform, my black boots. You have to wear your uniform for visits. I'm excited for my first visitors. And I was excited to be able to let Dad know that I was doing just fine. I go down to the room outside the visiting room, and they start calling folks in. DeTillo, come to the visiting room. Bear, come to the visiting room. No Baroni. It's now 8:45. No Dad. It's now 9 o'clock. No Dad. And all of my fears, they got hurt. They got lost. There was an accident. Somebody is sick. They're in the hospital. All of the fears, the very things that I worried about, the reason I chose to go in and get it over with, all of a sudden at 9 o'clock, I haven't had anxiety in a week and a half in federal prison. At that moment, I'm sitting there, full anxiety. Where's Dad? Because he can't call. 9:15, no Dad. I'm like, oh my God, I did this. I'm in prison. They drove over here. There was an accident. This is my fault. 9:30. They call count. They'd shut down the prison. I am in full, it was awful. And on the way to the bunk, I picked the phone up. And I dial the prison phone to Dad's cell phone. He answers the phone. Thank God. Hey, Bill. I'm like, hey, Pop. Where are you? We're in the parking lot. What are you doing in the parking lot? He said, well, when we got here, they had just shut everything down for the count. I said, yeah, Pop, I get that. But I thought you were getting here at 8:30. He said, when we came down this morning to come over to visit you, they have a breakfast buffet. And my father says what every 75-year-old man at that moment would say, it came with the room. And I said to him, I said, Pop, and he said, listen, it's not like you're going anywhere. Absolutely true. The second reminder is the role of your friends. You know, in politics, sometimes you meet people that are your friends because you got a title, or you may have a title, you may have a future title, or the office that you hold. Again, as I said before, 90% of those people disappeared within seconds of the word bridge and the word gate being put together. Gone. But not everybody. Not everybody ran away. I mentioned Kristen before, didn't run away. My friend Tom Byrne, former Democratic state chairman, my friend since I was in high school, didn't run away. My friend Fran Smith, some of you remember her late husband, Bob Franks, didn't run away. My friend Lisa took months of vacation time off and came and worked on the case. Friends. Mike Levy. You probably don't know Mike Levy. Mike Levy and I were in law school together. Not only were we in law school together, we sat next to each other on the first day of law school at orientation. And I remember at the Supreme Court afterwards, I remember making a comment that you may remember that great movie, The Paper Chase, right? Anybody who's lawyers in the room may remember this, right? The dean would come down and say, look to your right, look to your left. One of you won't be here when law school's over. Well, the University of Virginia Law School is like, look to your right, look to your left. One of you will represent the other in the Supreme Court. The day after I was convicted, Mike Levy, who I would see periodically at reunions, sent me an email. Maybe it could have been that night. Really sorry about the case. Why don't we get together and talk? So we got together the day after the presidential election, the following Wednesday, and we had lunch and we talked about the case, and he said to me that, and I had not known this, he had been in charge of the appellate division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York City, in the Southern District. Now was at a big law firm, Sidley and Austin. And and Mike says to me, I said, we can handle this appeal for you. I said, Mike, that would be great. I can't afford you. I had to cash everything I had in just to pay for my lawyers, and then some. And I certainly couldn't afford Sidley and Austin. He said, Bill, you're my friend. And he got Sidley to represent me pro bono. Took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. So you never know when you come to one of these Chamber of Commerce lunches who you're sitting next to. Except Herb. We all know we're sitting next to Herb. And one final friend. You heard me mention before, and that's John Hollop. John and his wife and I were roommates in Hamilton for a while. And John's a big-time Trenton lobbyist. Lots of great clients. Worked in politics, managed campaigns. I mean, Herb remembers him. He was Bob Pernetti's campaign manager a couple of times. John had every reason in the world to be one of those friends who said, you know, his business is going to, and he wasn't. John was one of those people who stepped up. Picks me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, takes me to prison. Drives across the state, picks me up to take me home from prison. Didn't even know what time I was going to get out. He said I'd spend the day there. He'd spend the night there, waiting. John didn't care that I had a title, or I had a big business, or I was a senator, or I sponsored a bill, or I ran the Port Authority. He was my friend. And one of my pieces of advice to you, if you don't have a John Hollop in your life, whether you're a politician or a business owner, if you don't have a John Hollop in your life, find one. Because when everything goes away, it may not be because you get hopefully not charged with a federal crime, but when everything goes away, you need those people. I learned that. And the third lesson that I learned, it reminded me why I went into public service. Being in prison reminded me why I was in public service. You know, I got there to prison, and you got to get a job. And I was assigned to education, to teach. So I taught some adult ed classes, but I was also tasked to teaching GED. I actually looked this up. The Department of Justice, for federal inmates, almost 27% of federal inmates do not have a high school degree. 12% don't have an 8th grade degree. The state systems are much higher, well into the 40s. And I was assigned to teach GED. And I was matched with a guy named Calvin. Calvin's a kid from Detroit, about a 5-year sentence, drug sentence. Calvin had gone to school, but had never finished high school. And Calvin was trying to pass the GED. And day in and day out, Calvin and I would sit there at this beaten up old desk in what became the visiting room on weekends. And I would teach him math or reading or science as he tries to pass the GED. And he was so grateful for what I was teaching him. But what he was teaching me was even more important. He taught me why I did public service. It wasn't for a title. It wasn't for an award. It wasn't for my name on a lawn sign or a bumper sticker. It was for that moment. And people in this room, whether we're in East Windsor or Trenton, whether we're in the county government or President of the United States, that moment reminded me why we do politics and public service. And there's lots of great nonprofit groups in this room. You know it. Going to prison reminded me of that. And I remember that day that I got out, and John's there in the parking lot, waiting to leave, and it was right at dinner time. So you only eat, it's like 20 minutes, you got to eat. You got to go in, you got to eat, and go back to your bunk. Calvin was the last guy. He popped his head out. Remember, there's no fences or anything. He popped his head out and waved goodbye. I never would have met Calvin. It was a high price to pay. Going to prison reminded me why public service actually is really important. Who's your Calvin? Whether you're a politician or a business owner or a lawyer or a nonprofit, who's that person that reminds you why you're doing what you're doing? And it's going to be different for everybody in this room. When you go home later, when you go back to work later, when you go back to your office later, think of who's your Calvin? And when you have moments of what you're doing, you're like, remember that person. And one other person I want to mention. So when I left that day, you check out like you're checking out of a hotel, right? The judge ordered me released. And I go to the front desk and I'm signing these papers. There's a lieutenant there from the corrections. And everybody there knew about the Bridgegate case. My nickname in prison was Billy Bridgegate. You go walk around a prison, have 85 prisoners yell, "Hey, Bridgegate." The lieutenant says, "Okay, Bridgegate, sign here, sign here." And I said to him, I just need my driver's license back. Because when you go to prison, you have to show up with your driver's license or ID to make sure it's actually you serving time. True. And he looks at me and got this folder in front of me. He said, "I don't have your driver's license." I said, "Well, I gave it when I showed up." They said, "Give it back when I leave." He says, "Well, you can stay here for a few more days and we can look for it." I said, "No, it's all right, I'll leave." So I come home and I had to go get stuff I had in storage up in New York, and I didn't have anything. I didn't have my passport because the government had it. I couldn't find my birth certificate. I'd packed everything up to leave to go to prison. I didn't expect to be back this quick. Next day I came down, Dad and June picked me up at the train station. We went over to DMV or MVC, whatever they call it now, over in Baker's Basin. And all I had was an expired New Jersey driver's license and an expired passport, with the hole in it. And I go to line number 9, where you get a duplicate driver's license. I have the little card, and I have these two, and I finally get up to the front. There's a woman behind the counter who was probably registering cars when Henry Ford was making them. And I hand her, she doesn't look up, I hand her things, she doesn't even look up, she says, "I can't take this." And I look at her and she looks at me and we both look down on her desk to the Trentonian, on which I was on the front page. And she sort of smiles and she says, "Do you have a credit card?" "I do." Gave her a credit card. She starts typing. And she says to me, "I'm from Hamilton." She says, "I always voted for you. And I'm really sorry you're going through this." And she said, "But keep fighting. People around here, we get what happened." She types it up, she gives me the credit card, and she grabs my hands. And she says, "Be strong. It's going to be okay." Then she says, "Can I come give you a hug?" So she gets up, she walks out from behind the counter, and we're from the middle of the floor, and she gives me this big hug. She's going to be okay. And I am doing everything I can. All of the emotion for the past 3 months, 24 hours, 6 years. Doing everything I can not to break down in tears. Now, admittedly, I would not be the first person at MVC to cry. But as I left, it reminded me of something. Reminded me of something that going to prison allowed me to learn. you can go home again. Thank you all very much. Sit down, sit down. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. The last time that many people stood up for me was, the jury. So great. It's great. I appreciate that. So I'm going to take questions. I hope you have some questions. I hope they are easy.